Alright, everyone, this story's called Forewarned. Several years ago in Taylor County, there lived an elderly couple. One night, as they slept, the woman was suddenly awakened by noise in the room. When she sat up in bed, she noticed a strange white figure at her husband's closet. The figure appeared to be searching for something. Finally, it disappeared out the door and down the steps. The next morning, the woman told her husband of this strange happening. He consoled her as she appeared to be quite upset and assured her that she had had a bad dream and that everything would be all right. After a while, she began to believe he was right and soon forgot her supposed dream. A few nights later, she was again awakened by a strange noise. This time, the figure was searching through the drawers. The woman was so frightened that she screamed loudly, awakening her husband. She was again consoled by him and reassured that it was only a dream. The next morning, the old man decided to get up early, make the journey into town to seek a doctor for his wife, since he felt she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. While he was gone, a long black coach drawn by 4 black horses pulled up outside their small cottage. The man in charge, who turned out to be the mortician, came to the door seeking the body of the husband. He told the woman that he had found her husband's clothes and personal belongings in a sack at his office that morning with a note that he had died. The note went on to tell just how he was to be dressed and put in the coffin. The body was to be picked up at the home. Suddenly they heard a horse making a strange noise in the barn near the house. The woman was still exclaiming that the mortician had made an error as she hurried to see what all the commotion was about. There inside the door of the barn lay her husband's dead body. The horse was their own. The husband had died in the barn even before getting started on his trip to the doctor. The clothes the undertaker had found in his office proved to be those of her husband, and he was buried in them. This one here is called A Forecasted Death. Now, Charlie Hardesty and his wife had made a habit of stopping by my grandparents' house for coffee and gossip after church. One afternoon, Charlie told grandfather that some strange things had been happening to him all week and that he knew he was going to die very soon. Grandfather asked him if he were ill or what made him think that he was about to die. Now, Charlie said that he had never felt better, and indeed he looked to be in the best of health. But while he was working in the fields or doing chores around the house, he could hear a voice calling his name and saying, "Come with me." Grandfather said it gave him a chill when Charlie, in a calm, matter-of-fact way, said that he would be going with the voice before too long. The next Sunday, Miss Hardesty told grandmother that something strange was going on around their farm. Charlie didn't have much livestock, and the animals he had were just like pets. Down to the last chicken, he had given each a name, and the animals often followed him and his wife around the farm. Now, there was no fence around their house, but the animals seemed to know this was sacred ground, and with the exception of a few bold chickens, rarely came into the yard. But this week, the animals couldn't seem to get close enough to Charlie. They crowded into the yard. They followed him around, pushing each other in order to get closer to him. And stranger yet, they stood around the house at night, not making a sound, but just standing there as if they were waiting for something. And the other night, the horse had come all the way down from the upper pasture and pushed his nose right into the bedroom window. The banging shutter had awakened Miss Hardesty. Although the horse himself hadn't made any noise, he just stood there, staring at Charlie. "I declare, Bertha," she told Grandmother, "it's just plain spooky the way those animals are acting, so quiet and all." My grandmother knew what Charlie had told Grandfather, but she kept quiet, knowing that if Charlie had wanted his wife to know, he would have told her himself. "And Charlie," Miss Hardesty went on, "now he's the biggest mystery of all. I have been nagging at him for years to fix that leaky roof and my garden fence, but here in this last week, he must have thought I meant my threat of no more food till they were fixed. And he's told me about all the things that need to be done this winter and who would be the best buyer for our products later in the summer." Now on Wednesday morning, Grandfather had just finished his chores and was leaving for the fields. Grandmother was starting to the house with the eggs when they both looked up and saw Miss Hardesty driving the team and wagon across the little bridge at breakneck speed. They both knew at once what must be the matter. After the first flood of tears, Miss Hardesty calmed down and told them what had happened. Charlie had taken longer than usual to eat his breakfast that morning, and before leaving to do his chores, he had told her to keep well and safe, and had kissed her forehead, addressing an I'm ready now to seemingly no one. He had gone. She had been waiting for him to bring the cream so she could make butter, and noted that it was taking Charlie an unusually long time to finish the milking. Glancing out the window, she saw all the animals grouped around the barn door, strangely quiet. Even the chickens had stopped their squabbling and were standing motionless. Miss Hardesty said that some strange fear gripped her as she walked to the barn. Then she saw Charlie. He was lying on the floor, just as he had slipped from the milking stool. The cow was standing motionless and stiff, half leaning against the opposite wall. Charlie had a slight peaceful smile on his face, and she knew somehow that he was dead. The animals still acted strangely, standing forlornly about until after the funeral services were over. And the cow had to be milked outside after that, refusing to go into the stall where her master had died. And you can't blame her for that, right? My grandparents still wonder about it. How did the animals know what was happening? And what were the strange voices Charlie had heard? This one here is called The Fortune Teller's Prophecy. A young man and his wife who had come to West Virginia from Italy were expecting their first child. And as was the custom in the old country, they consulted a fortune teller about the sex and future of their child. The Italians believed that gypsy women possessed the powers of black magic, so it was with awe and fear that the young couple approached the fortune teller's hut. After they had crossed her palm with silver, the woman told them that they would have a son. but she soon dispelled their joy with the announcement that their son would be born with a knife in his hand, and that he would slay his parents. Frightened out of their wits, they hurried away. But as the months went by, they began to look forward to the coming of their first child, and not even the gypsy's warning disturbed them. In due time, their son was born with a strange pointed object clasped in his little fist. The prophecy rushed back into their minds. Although it nearly broke their hearts, they gave the child to the young wife's cousin, who was moving to another state to find work. The boy was raised as the cousin's son, and it was only after he married and brought his beautiful wife back to the mining country of West Virginia he was told who his real parents were. Wanting to surprise her husband, the young wife sent a letter to his parents, asking them to come visit. Now very old, they walked 40 miles to the little mining community where their son lived. Their daughter-in-law greeted them, and since they were very tired, she gave them her bed to rest up in while she went to tell her husband, who was at work. The foreman had let the men off early that day, and the young man approached his home a few minutes after his wife had left. Looking into the small, darkened room, he saw two figures in the bed. Thinking his wife had a lover, he stepped noiselessly into the kitchen and back into the bedroom with a butcher knife. When his wife came back, she found him sitting on the edge of the bed with the knife, looking with grief and bewilderment into the faces of the parents he never knew. Thus, the fortune teller's prophecy was fulfilled. This one here is called The Warning Light. Now, on August 12th, 1919, something happened to me that I have never forgotten and never will forget as long as I live. I had been dating a good-looking young man who lived in the community. The only way I was able to see him at first was to sneak out behind my mother's back, because she objected to this young man. She told me that he was not a good man and would bring much sorrow to my life, but I did not listen. I went on seeing him in secret places without her knowing it. My mother died the next year and was buried in the small country church cemetery in our community. After 2 years, I was still dating the same young man. About 3 months before we were to be married, we had just started home from a church festival in our buggy. About 300 yards from the church, just below the cemetery where my mother was buried, the horses began to shy and prance and rear up in the air. My boyfriend jumped out of the buggy, grabbed the horses by the bits, and held them until I could get out of the buggy. Just as I got out, the horses jerked out of his hands and ran down the road as if the devil himself were in them. There we stood with no way to get home, but to walk. Okay? As we started down the road, I saw a light in the cemetery about the size of a bushel basket. It was not a bright light, just a dim glow, but it was about 3 feet above the ground and was moving slowly through the cemetery. It stopped and moved down into the ground, disappearing in front of my mother's grave, which was about 20 feet in front of us. I was so frightened that I began crying and shaking. It was all I could do to make it home. When we finally reached my house, I told my boyfriend good night and went inside. I stayed in the house for about a week, trying to figure out what had happened. I finally came to the conclusion that the glow was a warning from my mother for me to break off with this young man. And that is what I did. I never again had any acquaintance with him. Later on, my long forgotten boyfriend married another woman, and they lived together for 4 years. He began to drink heavily, and when he was drunk, he would beat his wife. One morning, his wife's body was found. She had been stabbed to death, and her husband had disappeared. All right, y'all, this one here is called Vision in the Snow. One day in the 1930s, my father hailed the cab driven by his friend Carl. The big, robust man with the heavy crop of reddish-brown hair was strangely silent. Gone was the smile that usually spread from ear to ear. In the depths of the depression, the cab company had put him on probation for picking up passengers who could not afford to pay their fares. One cold December night, not long after this, the office received a call for a cab to be sent to Crossroads. Now, the company sent Carl, but when he arrived at the designated address, there was no one living in the house. The neighbors told him that it had been vacant for several years. Thinking that some child had played a trick on the cab company, Carl started back to town. He had driven about a quarter of a mile when he saw a beautiful, black-haired young girl standing in the middle of the road, waving for him to stop. She was oddly dressed for late December. She wore no coat, and her long, sheer white organdy dress made ripples about her legs as the cold wintry wind blew it close to her body. When Carl stopped to inquire if anything was wrong, the girl asked if he would give her a ride into town. He was very reluctant to do this, since he knew he might lose his job. Nevertheless, he could not bear to leave her standing by the road on such a cold night. During the ride into town, conversation flowed freely. He learned that her name was Karen. She had been to a birthday party and was in a hurry to get home in case her family might be worried. Now, Carl thought that perhaps in her haste she had left her coat at her friend's home. When they reached their destination, Carl turned to open the door, but the girl was gone. Concerned, he went to the house and asked Karen's parents if she had entered the house. They replied that their daughter had been dead for 15 years. She had been killed in an automobile accident while returning home from a birthday party at Crossroads. They explained that many people had seen her on the road, as he had. According to reports, their daughter always tried to return home on her birthday and at Christmas. Now, when Carl arrived at the office, there was a message from him from Karen, thanking him for his kindness. He was promptly relieved of his position with the cab company for not charging the passenger fare. Depressed and dejected, he left the office and walked up the street. When he met my father, he told him the story. In spite of his concern over being jobless, the old contagious smile flashed across his face as he asked, "How can you change a ghost cab fare?" All right, y'all, this one here is called The Sweater. World War I was just over, and celebrations were being held by almost every town in the United States. In Shinston, the post-war celebration consisted of a big dance. My Uncle Joe had just returned from Europe and was in great spirits. He attended the dance with a few friends and neighbors. While he was standing in the hall watching the others dance, he noticed a very beautiful young lady standing by herself. He had never seen her before, but he walked up and asked her for the next dance. She accepted, and as they danced, he found that her name was Jane McQueen. They danced the entire evening together. It was love at first sight for Uncle Joe. When the dance was over, he walked her home. Jane's house was about 6 blocks from the dance hall, and since it was getting a little chilly, Uncle Joe offered the girl his sweater. She put it over her shoulders, and they walked on. When they arrived, he kissed her goodnight, and she stepped inside. Uncle Joe walked back down the street and thought of his pleasant evening. Then he remembered that Jane still had his sweater, and he decided to go back for it. When he arrived at Jane's house again, he knocked on the door and a man answered. Uncle Joe told him he had come for the sweater Jane wore home. The man seemed to be surprised and shocked. Tears came to his eyes. "There's some mistake. It couldn't have been my daughter. How can you be so foolish and cruel as to come to me on this night? My daughter died on her birthday a year ago tonight. She's buried only a few blocks away from here." Stunned beyond words, Uncle Joe turned from the tearful man and proceeded to the graveyard. When he arrived, he found his sweater lying on Jane's grave. All right, y'all, this one here is called The Breviary. Late one rainy evening, while driving home from a visit with a parishioner, the good Father Ireland came upon 2 old ladies walking along a lonely roadside. He took pity upon the 2 poor souls and offered them a lift. The ladies gratefully accepted the ride, directing him to a large Victorian house several miles down the road. Now, when the small party arrived, the 2 women invited the priest to share some hot tea and cake before he continued home. The evening was so cold and dismal that Father Ireland welcomed the invitation. The living room, with its old-fashioned furnishings, was comfortable though dowdy, and the fire in the old open earth soon made it warm and cozy. Warmed by tea and pleasant conversation, Father Ireland was finally reminded by the fire's dying embers that it was very late. He thanked his hostesses and continued his way home. More than halfway to his destination, he remembered he had left his breviary on the table. The next day, Father Ireland drove back to pick it up and found the house boarded up as if it had not been occupied for many years. It was unquestionably the same house, since it was the only one around for miles. After a thorough investigation, he visited the local real estate agent and inquired about the 2 old ladies. Instead of protesting, the agent assumed an air of this has happened before and drove with Father Ireland to the residence. After they pulled the boards away from the door and brushed cobwebs from the entrance, the old keys were fitted into the rusty lock. The door creaked open. A few steps away lay the forgotten breviary, next to some scattered cake crumbs on the table as mute testimony of the previous night's visit. Father Ireland turned to the agent, amazed, and asked what he knew about his friends. About a moment's hesitation, the agent explained that the house formerly belonged to 2 sisters, both old maids, who for many years had invited strangers into their home for tea and respite from traveling. Frequently, the 2 were seen walking the road and travelers offered them a lift. They always reciprocated the kindness with hospitality. After they died, the house remained vacant. No one seemed to want the home that once had served as a welcome haven to strangers. Months later, one of the local residents reported that he had given a ride to the same two ladies and had been entertained by them. No one paid much attention to the story at first, until gradually other people claimed they too had shared the same experience. Then the rumor grew that the old ladies had returned to continue the tradition after they had died. The spinsters had loved the old house, and it was assumed that they could not bear to leave it. This one here is called the plaid blanket. In the early 1960s, a young man named Francis was driving along a lonely highway outside Paris, France, one evening at about 10 o'clock. Although the highway was deserted, a very hard rain made it difficult for him to drive. As he crept along, he saw a beautiful young girl in a long white evening gown standing by the side of the road. Since she was not carrying an umbrella and he felt sorry for her, he pulled off the road and opened the door. The girl got in and told him her name was Juliette Jouvet. She gave him the address of her grandfather with whom she lived. Julie was trembling from the cold rain, so Francis offered her a plaid blanket, given to him by his deceased brother, to put around her shoulders. He noticed that the girl was very pale. Her skin had been a bluish cast. The couple engaged freely in conversation until they arrived at the girl's house. Upon their arrival, Julie quickly opened the car door and ran into the house without saying goodbye, thanking him, or returning his blanket. Francis, thinking her a rather strange young woman, drove off, hoping to return the next day for his treasured blanket. Early the following morning, he drove to the girl's home, walked up on the porch, and knocked at the door. Several minutes passed before his knock was answered. Finally, an old man came to the door and asked what he wanted. Francis explained that he wanted to see Julie Jouvet. The old man invited him in and introduced himself as Julie's grandfather. He was deeply interested in Francis's visit. Now, Francis explained that he had driven Julie home the night before, and she had forgotten to return the plaid blanket she had used to keep warm. He told her grandfather that if it had been just an ordinary blanket, he wouldn't have come after it. But this blanket had a special meaning. It had been given to him by his brother, who was killed in World War II, and it was the only thing he had to remember him by. M. Jouvet told him that his granddaughter had been dead for 10 years. She was killed in an automobile accident when she was 18 years old. He said that several other young men had come to him with similar stories. Now, Francis could not believe what he was hearing, so he described Julie to the old man, who said his granddaughter fit the description perfectly. Francis did not believe Julie was dead and kept insisting that M. Jouvet was mistaken. To prove himself correct, the man asked Francis to drive him to the graveyard on the outskirts of Paris, and he would show him Julie's grave and picture on her tombstone. As they drew close to the girl's grave, both men saw the plaid blanket folded neatly upon it. Alright, y'all, this one here is called The Lost Couple. Now, in the late 1920s, a girl and her boyfriend were on their way home from a date. As they drove along the narrow old road in the pouring rain, the wheels hit a rut and the car fell over the steep bank below. Both families were worried when the young people didn't get home that night, but they thought that perhaps the two had run away to get married as they had so often spoken of doing. Now, several weeks went by, and still there was no word. Every rainy night it was reported that as people drove along the road where the couple had last been seen, the figure of a young woman in white suddenly appeared in front of the headlights, waving frantically for them to stop. But when they investigated, she would vanish. Then one night a coal miner was on his way home from work, and when the girl appeared, he searched the heavily foliaged bank, and there were the remains of the lost car with the couple inside, dead all that time. After that, the figure was never seen again on the lonely road. All right, y'all, this one here is called The Living Corpse. A young man riding home on horseback was delayed so that he had to travel at night. On his way, he had to pass a cemetery. Since he was traveling by himself, he was somewhat uneasy and frightened, which is rightfully so. All at once, he came upon a young woman sitting beside the road crying. He stopped and asked if he could help. She told him that she had been walking all night trying to get to town. She was so tired and weak that she could not go on. He told her he would be glad to help her. He lifted her up on the black stallion, and they galloped toward town. Steadying the woman on the horse with one hand and holding the reins with the other, the man soon became tired, as the woman seemed to get heavier and heavier. When they arrived in the town, he got off the horse to help the young woman down and realized that she was a corpse. The townspeople at the inn told him that every year on the anniversary of her death, this woman rose from her grave, and her family then reburied her. This one right here, y'all, is called The Unhappy Bride. Now, one night, a group of boys were riding around in a car when they saw a lady in a white gown standing at an intersection. She motioned for them to stop, and when they did so, she got into the car. They spoke to her, but she didn't answer. As they came near a cemetery, she motioned for them to stop. Since it was raining, they were going slowly, and she jumped out of the car while it was still moving. The boys were amazed because they didn't see any homes near the cemetery. They went on down the road to a gas station and told the attendant what had happened. He told them a strange story. 5 years before, on that same date, a very prominent young couple from that area had been married. As they were about to leave on their honeymoon, a long line of cars was following them. They were all honking their horns and not paying too much attention to the intersection they were approaching, when a large truck hit the bridal car. The groom was killed instantly and the bride died later. The legend was that the bride came back every year to wait for her husband to pick her up. The boys didn't believe the story and went back for another look. As they approached the intersection, they saw the lady once more. Again she got into the car, and again she would not speak. They asked who she was, but she would not answer. When they reached the cemetery, she wanted to get out, but they wouldn't let her open the door. They turned on the inside light to see her, and were startled. Her once beautiful face was decayed. Her eyes were merely sockets in her head. As she parted her lips, she screamed and disappeared. This one here is called The Vanishing Lady in Black. Now, Alex Jennings worked as a chauffeur for the wealthy Miss James P. Leonard in Detroit, Michigan. On this special occasion, he was working late. Now, Miss Leonard was attending a dinner at the Masonic Temple, and Alex decided he would go to a little restaurant a few blocks away to eat. And while away while away the time until he should return for his employer. Finding a parking place he always been a problem around the popular little restaurant, and Alex was forced to park the car quite a distance away. But he decided the delicious food was worth the extra steps. The parking space he found was on a small, desolate street with 3 old houses on each side. As he was driving along the little street, he was startled to see a lady in a black dress walking along the street to the right of his car. As surprising as her costume was the suddenness of her appearance, it was as if she had come from out of the air. As Alex parked the car just ahead of where the lady was walking, he glanced in the mirror and saw her face staring back at him. This gave him cold chills, for her face was milk white and her eyes were like burning coals. Alex slowly got out and locked the car. When he looked up, he saw that the lady was walking up the path to one of the houses, although it appeared to be vacant. About halfway up the walk, she turned around and looked at him again. For some unexplainable reason, Alex decided to follow her. As he started up the walk, he glanced up and she was gone. He was positive she had not opened the door or entered the house. He walked on up to the house, and although there was no lights on, he felt he should knock, and did so again and again, but no one answered. While he was standing there, he thought he saw 2 eyes peer from behind a blind in the window next to the door. He finally gave up and walked on to the restaurant. While he was eating, he kept thinking about the strange lady in black. When he returned to the car, he was still wondering what had happened to her, but it was time to pick up his employer, and so he drove away. The next day, his mind kept wandering back to the lady he had seen the night before. Because everything about her was so mysterious, he decided to return to the lonely street and investigate. When Alex arrived there, he saw an old man taking care of the lawn of the house next to the one where the strange lady had disappeared. He walked over and asked if anyone occupied the next house. The old man looked up from his work and slowly shook his head. "Not for many, many years," he replied. "Well, that is strange," Alex said, and related the events of the previous evening. After hearing the story, the old man had a puzzled look on his face. He decided to accompany Alex, and together they could investigate the matter. They went up the walk the lady in black had traveled the night before. The porch of the house was thickly coated with dust, and Alex could see 2 small, dainty footprints going up the steps. The tracks reached the middle of the porch and stopped. They did not go any further or retrace. The door of the house was still about 6 feet from the last footprint. Alex was more confused now than ever, and asked the old man if he could explain the mystery lady. The man said that an old lady named Miss Ethel Jackson had lived in the house many years before. One night, as she was returning from visiting her husband's grave, she collapsed on the porch of the house. She presumably died of a heart attack. As her heart was failing her, she struggled to reach the doorway, but she never made it that far. Her body was found with her hand outstretched as if reaching for the doorknob. Alright, y'all, this one here's called the Phantom Lady. The only person I've ever known who has taken a ghost for a ride is my great uncle. He used to travel around the neighboring counties doing upholstering for various people. His 2 sons usually accompanied him on his longer trips. Now, most of these trips were dull, but one was quite extraordinary. On this particular night, there was a heavy thunderstorm. My uncle and his son stopped at the railway station in a little town called Vienna to get something to eat. When they started out again, the storm was worse than ever, for the wind had picked up, driving the rain down even harder. They were about 8 miles from the little town and were about to turn off on another road when something caught their eye. Out in the middle of the storm stood a lady in a long blue evening gown. Behind her was a cemetery. My great uncle, quite surprised by the sight, drove over and offered her a ride. She was soaked with rain and asked if he could take her to the railway station he had just left. He obligingly said he would, and opened the door for her to get in the back seat. When they reached the station, she got out of the car, thanking my uncle and his sons for all the trouble that they had gone to. She then hurried toward the station. Still a little puzzled by the incident, they started home again. About 8 miles up the road, when they were again about to make the turnoff, there stood the same lovely lady in her long blue evening gown in front of the cemetery. They wondered how she could have gotten back so quickly, and when they felt the back seat where she had sat, they found it quite dry. They made their turn off, and when they looked back, she was gone. My great uncle drove that road many times, but he never had such an encounter ever again. All right, y'all, this one here is called Hitchhiker at Follinsby. Some years ago, a few minutes before midnight, Tom Smarilla was warily driving from Follinsby, West Virginia, to Paris, Pennsylvania. As he drove along, he noticed a hitchhiker wearing a black dress with a black veil and apparently crying. He stopped and asked the young woman if he could take her anywhere, and she got in. Once she was in the car, she didn't say a word. All she did was sit in the front seat and weep. After about 10 minutes of this constant crying, Tom offered her his handkerchief. She took it and proceeded to dry her eyes and face. Now Tom kept driving, and right outside of Paris, his lights flashed on a medium-sized cemetery to the right. Immediately, the young lady tapped on Tom's shoulder, and he stopped the car. She left him in the vicinity of the graveyard. Tom went on to his work in Paris, and after work and some sleep, he decided to make a visit to the graveyard. He knew it would be dark when he got there, so he took a flashlight. When he entered the graveyard, he felt apprehensive about the whole situation, but began looking around the tombstones. About 30 feet ahead, his light hit something white. When he advanced and looked at the tombstone, he found his handkerchief draped across it with "Thanks" scratched on it in dirt. He took the handkerchief and read the name on the headstone, Mary Ann Jonathan. When he looked at the dates on the tombstone, he saw that the girl had been 26 years old when she died. Later, Tom went to the home of the girl's parents, where he was shown a picture of the young woman he had picked up and told that she had died of carbon monoxide poisoning. What he wanted most, however, another glimpse of the dead girl, never came, although he drove the same road many times. All right, y'all, this one here is called The Restless Soul. Years ago, a teamster stopped at a farmhouse and asked to spend the night. The farmer didn't have enough room for him, but suggested his brother's house down the road. The brother had died 5 years ago, and the house was haunted, but the teamster could stay there if he could stand it. The teamster was tired and didn't believe in ghosts anyway, so he said, "I'll take the chance and stay." He drove down, put the horses in the barn, and went into the house. It was clean looking, as though someone was living there. He built a fire and relaxed for a little while. Then, being very tired, he blew out the oil lamp and went to bed. He went to sleep immediately, but suddenly something awakened him by climbing into bed and getting behind him. Then the thing started twisting and turning. The teamster didn't know what to think. After a while, he said, "If you are going to sleep with me, you will have to lie still." A voice said, "I've been dead for 5 years, and I come back every night. But you are the first person who has spoken to me. What do you want?" "When I died, I owed a neighbor $15, replied the ghost. He named the man and said, "If you will promise that you will tell my brother to pay him, I'll leave and never come back." "I'll pay him myself if you'll leave and never come back," said the teamster. "Now I can rest in my grave." The teamster never heard another thing that night. The next morning he went to the brother's house and told him what had happened. The brother called the neighbor and asked him if his brother had owed him $15, and he said he had. The brother paid him that day, and the house was never haunted after that. All right, y'all, this one here is called The Muddy Gown. When Maria was born, Doris was very proud to stand as her godmother. However, as she later found, her godchild was to bring her sadness, for 18 years later, Maria died in a car wreck. Doris tried not to think too much about the girl's death, but on All Souls Night, she had a very strange dream. She dreamed that Maria came to her and asked if she had a gown she could lend her to wear to the procession to be held on All Souls Night. The girl explained that when she had died, they hadn't put any in the coffin, and now she needed one to wear. She asked Doris to get one of her gowns and place it by the living room door. Doris awoke from her dream, not knowing what to think. She felt obliged to do something, but felt strange because she knew Maria was dead. After a great deal of contemplation, she decided to dismiss the whole matter and go back to sleep. As sleep came over her, she began to dream again. This dream was also about Maria, and much like the first. Again, the girl asked for a gown, and she also asked Doris why she had not left one by the door as requested the first time. She explained again that she wanted to walk in the procession and begged her godmother to get a gown for her to wear. Waking from her dream, Doris was more confused than ever. She decided to awaken her husband and tell him about the dreams. Her husband thought she was probably just upset and told her to go back to sleep. She was finally persuaded to do this, but felt she must leave one of her gowns near the door. She did so and returned to bed. Just before Doris awoke in the morning, she had another dream about Maria. The girl told her that she was sorry, but she had gotten the gown dirty. During the procession, it had rained and mud had been splashed on it. As Doris got out of bed, she kept thinking about the last dream and hurried to the living room door where she had placed the gown. At first, she thought it had never been touched, but as she picked it up, she felt that it was wet. And then she noticed the mud on it. Strangely enough, it looked as if it had been worn in a procession during the rain. This one here is called The Roadside Stranger. Now, in the early 1930s, a salesman who had a rural route through the central part of West Virginia had a strange experience. It was during the spring when flash floods are quite prevalent. As he was driving along in his car near Muddlety, he noticed a young woman waving to him from the side of the road. He stopped and offered her a ride. She got into the car, told him her name, and said he would have to take a detour because the bridge had been washed out just ahead. After showing him the way around the washout, she pointed out an old house where she said she lived, and he dropped her off and drove on. Several miles down the road, he stopped at a rural store. Inside, there were some men sitting around a burnside stove and talking. It wasn't long before he was in the middle of the conversation. When he told of the experience he had just had, an elderly gentleman sitting in the corner looked up and asked, "What was her name?" "Ida Crawford," the salesman answered. "Why?" "Well," said the old man, "she's done it again." Then he told his story. Many years before, a young woman was riding along in her carriage on a spring night. She was just passing over that bridge when it collapsed from the raging floodwaters. Her body was never recovered. Since then, she had returned 2 different times, saving the lives of travelers along that route. The old man looked up and said, "You, sir, are the third." The salesman was so astonished that he got up, walked to his car, and went back to the house where he had let the girl out. He found that the house looked as though it had been deserted for years. He searched the entire place over, looking for some clue to further information about the girl, but found none. All right, y'all, this one here is called A Boy and His Dog. A boy and his dog been missing for 2 days. No one could find them. People searched everywhere, thinking that they were lost in the woods. They were eventually found in a very mysterious way. One dark night, as 2 railroad policemen were patrolling the tracks, they saw a strange dog about 300 yards away. The dog seemed to glow in the dark. Holding their clubs in their hands, the policemen began to run toward the dog. But just before they reached the spot where he was standing, he disappeared before their eyes. As the sun began to rise, the men hurried back to the spot to find out what had actually happened the previous night. When they got there, they found nothing on the trestle where they had seen the dog. So they searched the ground beneath it. There they found the bodies of the boy and his dog. It was assumed that a train hit them and knocked them underneath the trestle where they lay. People still believe that the dog's ghost came back to help someone find the body of his master. All right, y'all, this one here is called The Phantom Bridesmaid. Joe Elsie's best friend was being married in Glade Run, across Glade Pond from Joe's home. Now, Joe planned to skate across the frozen lake to the wedding. Unfortunately, business had delayed him, and he was compelled to make his journey at night. Joe was in love with one of the bridesmaids in the wedding, and this was one reason he was so anxious to get to attend. But Janet's father had lots of money, and Janet lived in a fine house and wore expensive clothing. This made it almost impossible for Joe to think of marrying her. He decided, however, to tell her that night that he loved her. This determination grew as he sped along under the starlight. Suddenly he felt as if he were not alone. His eyelashes were frosted, and he thought it might have been an illusion. But right before him seemed to skate a tall white lady. The mysterious figure was going very fast, and this aroused his curiosity. He started following the skater, though she was leading him from the route he had planned. Joe suddenly found himself at his destination. Even though his course had been altered, the mysterious skater had disappeared. As Joe took his skates off, he looked out over the part of the lake he had planned to travel. He could see blue waves through the choppy ice. If he had tried to skate there, he would now have been in a cold, wet grave. He made his way to his friend's house, where he expected to see preparations for a big wedding. When he knocked on the door, a sad-looking gentleman answered and told him that there was to be no wedding for a couple of days. Janet, the bridesmaid, had died of a terrible cold and flu. Joe realized now who had saved him. He stayed at Glade Run till Janet was buried and his friends married. Finally, Joe had to start home, but he waited until night to make his journey. He hoped to be met again by the white skater. This one here is called Friendship Never Dies. Now, Paul Simon and David Young grew up in the same small town in northern Kansas. They were neighbors, and as children they were inseparable. Their friendship grew as they did, and since they were the same age, it was easier for them to stick together. When they had completed high school, they joined the Marines on the buddy plan and received basic training together. Afterwards, both were sent to Vietnam. They were not placed in the same company upon their arrival, but they saw each other often. Paul was the first of the two to enter an actual combat zone. His company was ordered to enter an area known to be crisscrossed with Viet Cong supply routes. Their assignment was to set up a concealed campsite and observe activities without engaging the enemy, if possible. Paul's company had been out of the main camp about 5 days when they sent word that they were being attacked by a much larger force of North Vietnamese regulars. They reported many casualties and requested immediate reinforcement. David's company was the one chosen to reinforce his friends. It took the second company nearly 10 hours to reach the first. It was now dark, and it promised to be a long night. The officers of the first company had been killed, as well as over half the men. David was given the job of gathering the dog tags from the dead soldiers. With each corpse he approached, he was filled with dread, for Paul had not been accounted for. At the end of his task, he was full of despair. Paul could not be found. As the night wore on, the new company and what was left of the first braced themselves for another assault from the jungle. The attacks of the Viet Cong were varied and often deadly. They had possession of several Marine uniforms, and when they made more than one attack, they sometimes tried to fool the outer guards into thinking they were Marines who were missing from the last battle. Some of these Vietnamese knew a few words of English and could speak them perfectly. David was placed at a guard position along with another Marine. They were instructed to shoot anything that wouldn't stop it on command. The faint cry started just before dawn. David couldn't quite understand the words, but they seemed to be calling a corpsman. First, he thought it was a trick, but then he worried about his friend Paul. Could his best friend be out there calling for help? David made his way cautiously through the jungle until he came to a small clearing in the dense growth. There was a body lying at the foot of a small tree, partially covered with brush and clothed in a Marine uniform. But it was not making any sound. David approached the man slowly with his gun leveled. When he was close enough, he recognized the face of his friend. He lost control of himself and fell beside the motionless body. After a few moments, he made up his mind to take Paul's body back with him. As he bent over his friend to pick him up, Paul's voice, barely a whisper, told him to turn around and fire. He did so without thinking of where the order was coming from. He killed the Viet Cong soldier with one shot and turned to his buddy, whom he now believed to be alive. He made it back to his position without incident and sent his fellow guard to bring back a doctor. After the guard left, David bent over Paul to see if there was anything he could do for him before the doctor came. His heart nearly stopped when he couldn't find Paul's pulse. His friend seemed not to be breathing at all. When the doctor arrived, he examined Paul and turned to David with a puzzled look on his face. David knew by now that his friend was dead. He told the doctor how Paul had warned him in the jungle only a few minutes earlier. The doctor gazed at David skeptically for a moment. Then he announced that Paul had been dead at least 8 hours. All right, y'all, this one here is called The Night of the Stranger. The night was very bad as Janet started on her way home. She had been to a party at a friend's house and had not realized how bad the weather had become. As she started to leave, Debbie called out to her and suggested that she stay all night, but Janet, realizing that her father would need the car and that her family would be worried, decided to go on. After she started the car and turned down the lane, she realized how hazardous the road was and wondered if she should have stayed after all. To take her mind off her worries, she turned on the radio. The radio started blasting out the rhythm of her favorite song, and this soothed her nerves. All at once, the music stopped and the announcer warned of road conditions. Snow has blocked all the roads to Bellington. Roads will not be open until morning. As Janet heard this, she became more alarmed than ever. She made a hasty decision and started back. As she neared the turnoff to Debbie's house, she realized that the snow was drifted too high to drive the car through. Not realizing the danger of such a course, she decided to park the car and walk 3/4 of a mile. Janet had walked for an hour and still didn't see the lights of her friend's house. She knew by now that she was lost, hopelessly wandering around in the forest. She was frightened, but tried to keep her head. She began to feel the cold, her fingers were getting numb, and she was weary from walking. As she sat down by a huge maple tree, she could feel the warmth of her body start to leave. She was exhausted, but she knew if she went to sleep, she would never awaken. Nevertheless, she seemed to lose control of her senses and dozed off. Then all at once, she stirred as the figure of a man seemed to pass her. She tried to jump up. It was a person. She was saved. She called the stranger to her. Now Janet was unable to walk, and in order for the man to get her to the house, he carried her. He was a man in his late 50s and had a huge beard. But there was something odd about him, she realized. He was wearing summer clothing and was still warm. When the man reached the door with Janet, he laid her down on the step and knocked. When Debbie heard the knock and went to the door, she saw her friend lying on the steps. With some difficulty, she got her to the fire. As Janet began to get warm, she came to her senses. She told Debbie everything that had happened and finished her story by telling of the man who had saved her life. She even told of his being dressed in summer clothes and seeming not to feel the cold. As Debbie heard this, she gasped and said that the man was her great-grandfather. He was believed to have been killed in the very woods in which Janet had seen him 70 years before. All right, y'all, this one here's called How. Dwayne Poling drove to work every morning past a succession of landmarks downtown Vienna, a small suspension bridge, and a graveyard. He returned at night by the same route. One night it was fairly late when he was returning from his job at the power company, and night had already fallen. As he passed the little cemetery on the hill, he glanced over at it as usual. Suddenly a young man jumped out in front of the car, and Dwayne couldn't stop in time. Not until he had hit him. He hurriedly got out of the car and rushed over to the injured youth, who looked up and said, "Don't travel any further. the bridge is going to collapse. Dwayne knew the man needed medical attention, and he went back to the power plant to call an ambulance. After he called, he returned to the scene of the accident. The young man seemed to be badly hurt, and when the ambulance arrived, he was rushed to the hospital, but he was pronounced dead on arrival, still unidentified. Dwayne left his telephone number with the hospital attendants and told them to call when they found out the man's identity. Meanwhile, Dwayne called a construction company about the bridge. An inspection showed that the main suspension wire had been cut. If even one car had passed over it, the bridge would have fallen. Feeling that the young man had saved his life, Dwayne wanted even more to find out who he was. A day had passed, and the hospital officials decided to place a description of the youth in the Parkersburg Sentinel, hoping that someone could identify him. That night, an elderly lady came into the hospital and asked to see the body. When they showed it to her, a look of pride came over her face. The body was that of her son, Alan Shaw. The hospital officials asked her what she wanted done with the body, and she told them to put it back in the grave. He had been killed 5 years before in a car accident and had been buried in the cemetery near the suspension bridge. They called Dwayne and went out to the graveyard. Alan's grave had been dug into and the body removed. The hospital officials passed it off as vandalism, but Dwayne couldn't. He knew he had been saved. But how? All right, y'all, this one here is called Old Dork. Now, Old Dork was getting old and would soon be taken out of the mines and replaced by a younger mule. Ever since the animal had been brought into the mines, Dan McCain had worked with him. Now, Dan had grown to love Old Dork, and when the time came for the mule to be released from the mine, he gained permission to take him out to the farm where he lived. He wanted to see the poor aging mule spend the rest of his days in comfort. After a time, the miners went on strike, and Dan got behind on his rent. His landlord told him he would have to vacate the house, strike or no strike. The landlord was a greedy old man, interested in no one but himself. Now, the night Dan was told he would have to leave, he went out to the barn and tenderly put his arm around Old Dork. With tears in his eyes, he explained to him the situation. The next afternoon, the landlord was walking toward town when he noticed a mule running toward him faster than any mule could possibly run. He recognized the mule as Old Dork. The animal chased him until he reached town, panting for breath. He ran straight to the constable's home and promised to let Dan McCain live in the house for nothing if he would just get that mule off his back. Of course, Dan would have to start paying rent again as soon as the mines went back to work. The constable rode out to tell Dan the good news. He was shocked and astonished to find that Old Dork had died the preceding night in his sleep. All right, y'all, this one here is called Dead Man's Curve. It all started at a New Year's Eve celebration. The clock had just struck 12, and it was January 1st, 1952. Like millions of others everywhere, Greg Hardy, his wife Joan, and their friends Sam and Doris were in a festive mood. They all had been drinking a little, but Greg said he would take them for a short ride anyway. Greg began speeding, as his wife was afraid he would do. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, another car appeared, coming straight down the middle of the road. It seemed sure to hit Greg's car head on, but just in the nick of time, Greg cut sharply to the right and crashed down a steep embankment. When the dust and smoke had cleared away, Greg climbed from the car bleeding. He looked back inside and saw his wife and friends pinned in the car and hurt but still alive. He started to walk up the hill to get help, and as he came near the top, he saw a stranger. The man said he was Joshua Barr from Paintsville, and he offered Greg a ride to the hospital. Just before Greg fainted, Barr promised to send an ambulance back for the others once he reached the hospital. Several weeks later, after Greg had almost completely recovered from the accident, he decided he wanted to thank this Mr. Barr for saving his life and the lives of his wife and friends. So he got in his car and drove to Paintsville. There he found a place called Barr's General Store. Greg went in and asked where Mr. Barr was. The storekeeper said he would show him. They both got in Greg's car, and the storekeeper told him to drive to the cemetery. There he showed Greg a tombstone inscribed, "Here lies Joshua Barr, 1846 to 1906. Greg could hardly believe it, but it was true. In fact, he was the third person to claim that he had seen Joshua Barr, who had been killed 45 years before on that very curve. All right, y'all, this one here is called The Doctor's Warning. Carol Ann Charles felt sure that her coffin spells were nothing more than a nervous reaction. Her husband had died 2 weeks before, and although she had been feeling ill for the past several weeks, she had said nothing about it. She told herself that the cough would surely leave. Now, half an hour past midnight on June 12, 1910, she awoke with a start. Someone was in the room. Her husband, who practiced medicine for 30 years, had been an amateur parapsychologist and had told her many times there was nothing to fear from noises in the night. With that in mind, she sat straight up in bed. Her husband was standing beside her, his stethoscope in his ears and his medical bag at his feet. There was a warm smile on his face, the smile she had known and loved for so many years. Nevertheless, she was frightened. She didn't say a word. She just sat there in the darkness until she fell asleep. When she awoke in the morning, she was startled to find a sheet of paper on her bed. It was from her husband's prescription pad, and there was a note on it. "See Dr. Norton, State Street, Albany, urgent." Thinking it was a memo he had scribbled to himself before he died, she threw it in the fireplace and dismissed the entire incident as a dream. The following night, she awoke at the same time, and there he was again, stethoscope, medical bag, and all. Only this time he wasn't smiling. There was an expression of fear and anxiety on his face. It was the expression he had reserved for stubborn patients. His gentle smile came again, and he wrote something on a piece of paper, dropped it on the bed, and was gone. She turned on the light. The paper was from the prescription pad with the same message. The next morning, she decided to go to Albany and see Dr. Norton, who was a dear friend of her late husband. She told him everything that had happened, the midnight visits, the notes, her husband's expression of concern, everything. His face whitened. He told her that he too had received nightly visitations from her dead husband, with an urgent appeal to give her an examination. He did so that day. She had tuberculosis. Luckily, the disease was in its early stages, and within a few months, she was cured completely. Her husband's ghost never returned. All right, y'all, this one here is called The Storm. Since her husband's death, Sarah Dilger and her son Daniel had lived alone on their small farm about 10 miles from Burgoo. Although they were secluded, Sarah was hesitant about moving into town because the farm had meant so much to her husband. However, a narrow escape from tragedy changed her mind. The rivers were swollen from the torrential rains that had been pounding the earth for 2 days. This particular evening was chilly, and the wind was howling through the trees like a banshee. Firewood was running out, so Sarah asked Dan to bring more into the house. She warned him to be very careful. As she watched anxiously, he quickly gathered the fuel. He was trudging toward the house when a sudden gust of wind snapped a branch off a dead sycamore. Sarah screamed, but it was too late. The branch struck Dan's head, knocking him off his feet. She dashed out of the house and swept him up, calling his name over and over, but hearing no reply. Dan's head was bleeding profusely, and his face was ashen. Sarah knew she must find help, but how? Burgoo was 10 miles away, and the high water had washed the bridge out. She was frantic. She could see no solution. There was a rap on the door. No, she must be imagining it. Who could be traveling on such a night? She heard another rap and cautiously opened the door. There stood 2 water-soaked strangers. One short, chubby, and bald. The other was tall and lanky. Sarah immediately begged them to search out aid for her son. The short man, whose name was Martin Tucker, revealed that he was a doctor. After a thorough examination, Dr. Tucker concluded that he must operate at once to save the boy's life. Sarah was reluctant, but she agreed to let him try. The doctor suggested that since she was so distraught, she should get some rest. As she lay on the bed, a number of questions kept plaguing her. Where had these men come from? Why did they seem so strange? Was Tucker really a doctor? She finally dozed, and when she awakened, the operation was over. Dr. Tucker assured her that it was a success. Sarah blessed them and invited them to have dinner. She went into the kitchen to see what she could prepare for them, but when she returned, the 2 men were gone. After the storm had passed, Sarah went into town and told her friends of her experience and of Dr. Tucker. Sheriff Jones looked at her with a puzzled expression on his face. I knew a Dr. Tucker, he said, but he was killed 5 years ago in a train accident on a mercy journey. All right, y'all, this one here's called Ghost Father to the Rescue. In the late 1800s, the families around Smithfield were spread out and all was kept to themselves. Of course, when there was help needed, one could count on any of his neighbors to lend a hand. Otherwise, everyone kept his business to himself. Now, one family that lived about a mile from their nearest neighbor never seemed to come out among other people. This was a very poor family of 5. They farmed for most of their food and scraped for what few necessities they had to buy. One day, while the father was out in the fields plowing for the next season's planting, he became very ill. He had been overcome with the heat. He fell to the ground and called for help, but he was too far from anyone to make himself heard. There was nothing to do but lie back and try to rest. At a neighbor's house, the family had just sat down to their meal when they heard a noise outside. At the door stood a very old man in ragged clothing. The old man said that his son was in the fields plowing and needed help. The neighbor quickly put on his coat, saddled his horse, and started in the direction the old man had said his son lay. When he found the man on the ground, he went over, picked him up, and put him on the horse so he could take him home. After the man had rested for a time in his own house, he began to feel better. As the neighbor was talking things over, he said it was very lucky that the old father had been visiting and had gone with his son to the field. The sick man looked up in surprise and said, "My father? What do you mean? My father has been dead for 5 years." All right, y'all, this one here is called A Timely Warning. A deep autumn haze hung low over the wooded area of Smoke Hole. The brisk wind rustled the leaves on the ground. This was the first day of the hunting season. As the sun rose bright and promising, the hunters were already in the woods trying to shoot their quota of squirrels for the day. The squirrels sensed the danger and did not venture out of their soft hiding places. As a result, not many hunters were successful, so they decided to try their luck the next morning. Frank Jensen and his son Bob did not return to the lodge. They decided to make camp and spend the night in the woods. This would give them the advantage of being up earlier and perhaps having better luck. A hasty meal was prepared over a fire built on a large flat rock. The sun was fading very fast, and the forest took on the deep purple and dusty gray colors of evening. A peaceful quietness fell over the forest, and all sounds of animal life came to a stop. The two men placed their sleeping bags near the fire to keep warm and felt secure within the circle of the red glow. In the fading twilight, a hunter appeared from nowhere. A hound dog, wagging his tail, followed close at his heels. Both man and dog stood just outside the fire's glow. "Men, I wouldn't camp here for the night," he said. He explained that underneath the flat rock was a rattlesnake's nest. "Your fire is heating the rock now," he said, "and before morning the rattlesnakes will come out and bury their fangs in you." He turned to go and waved a hand with a missing left forefinger. After a few steps, he and his dog vanished from sight. A bright fire welcomed the men back at the lodge. They sat down to talk with the other hunters and told them of their visitor with the missing left forefinger and his warning. "Missing left forefinger?" one of them asked. "Why, that's the ghost of Tom Martin. 10 years ago, Tom camped on that very same rock and was found dead the next morning. His body had several fang marks of rattlesnake bites." All right, y'all, this one here's called The Ghost of the Rails. A neighbor of ours tells this story of his youth. He had been a wild, headstrong young man and had wanted to see all of our beautiful country before he settled down. So at 17, he had packed a few things, left a note for his folks, and hopped a freight train to a new, exciting life. Mr. Lance is an old man now, and his wanderlust is cured, but he says that on stormy nights he always remembers the strange events of a trip from Cleveland to his hometown of Rollsburg, West Virginia. It was during the winter of 1919, he says, that he walked to the outskirts of Cleveland, planning to hop a freight that was going close to home. After waiting a few minutes, he was surprised to notice a man squatting on his heels by the tracks. He had not heard him walk up. He remarked on the stranger's quietness and then asked him where he was bound. For judging from his gear, he was a rail bum too. Without turning, the man told him he was going to Rollsburg. Mr. Lance was delighted to find he would have a companion for the trip, but his friend wasn't very encouraging when he heard that the boy intended to join him. "No," he said, "you aren't going to be on the 11:15. At first, Mr. Lance was a little angry, and then he began to laugh. He told the stranger that he'd make it with more confidence than he felt. The stranger said no again, more sharply and strangely than before. "Why not?" Mr. Lance asked. "And why don't you come over here by the fire where I can see you?" The strange man just sat there staring at the rails again. Again, Mr. Lance was slightly angry and began to douse the fire. He could hear the whistle of the 11:15 in the distance. His companion got up slowly, his back to him as he was preparing to leave. "That train will cause your death," he said in his slow, chilling voice. Mr. Lance just stared at him, noticing for the first time that his shirt, a red and green plaid, was streaked with blood, muttering, "You're crazy," underneath his breath. He bent to finish dousing the fire. He confessed that he was in a great hurry to leave, for he was afraid of the man and angry with himself for being afraid. Suddenly he heard the man say, "You aren't going on that train, mister," right in his ear. He turned quickly, and the sight of that man's face chilled him. It was traced in patchwork fashion, with still bloody scars, and his whole face was twisted out of shape, the eyes bulging with a look of horror. Mr. Lance stared speechless, and then tried to push the horrible creature out of the way, but his hand went right through him. He screamed and then fainted. When he regained his senses, the train had gone, and so had his companion. When Mr. Lance arrived in Roseburg the next day, he went straight into the depot to see if Mike, the Irish janitor, would give him a handout. He ate his fill and started to go. Then he couldn't resist asking any longer. "Mike, did a strange fellow drop off here yesterday?" Mike answered that nobody had dropped, but someone had tried to jump off the Cleveland Special and had been caught beneath the wheels. No two pieces of him ended up in the same place. The only thing left was a piece of plaid shirt. "Red and green plaid?" Mr. Lance asked, fearing the answer. "Sure, and how did you know?" "Mr. Lance says he thinks of it often. He had heard of ghosts coming back, but he says he never heard of one traveling forward in time." All right, y'all, this one here is called The Lady in White. It was late in the afternoon many years ago when my grandfather and his brother were riding back from town. When they were just a few miles from the farm, they noticed another rider a little way in front of them. Since it was dusk, they could not make out who it was. All they could tell was that the person was dressed in white and was riding a white horse. They knew all the people who lived around them and all of their stock, but they did not recognize the horse or the rider. Since it was getting dark, they decided to ride up and see if they could be of any assistance to the stranger. As they drew nearer, they recognized the rider to be a lady. This seemed very strange to them, since a woman riding the backwoods at that time of night was not a common thing. As they approached the young woman, my great uncle called out to her. This seemed to frighten her horse, because it began to gallop after he called. It looked as if the rider couldn't control the horse, so my grandfather and his brother galloped after her. They followed the woman over fields and onto a seldom used road. A little way up the road, they saw a buggy overturned in front of them. The lady in white rode right past the buggy, not even slowing down to see if she could offer any assistance. She turned off and rode into the woods. When my grandfather and his brother reached the buggy, they saw it was their mother's. It was now a wreck. It looked as if it had turned over several times and it had landed against some rocks. They could not see their mother anywhere around. All of a sudden, the lady in white rode out from the woods a few yards down the road. My grandfather ran over to where she had been and found his mother lying there, unconscious but alive. When they got her home and she was feeling better, she explained that she had been out visiting and decided to take a shortcut home. Something had frightened her horse and he began to run. Then a wheel hit a hole and the buggy overturned. That was the last thing she remembered. She asked what made the boys take this out of the way road, and they explained that they had seen and followed the lady in white. They told her how they had found the buggy, but at first couldn't see its driver. Then they explained how the lady in white led them to the spot where she had been thrown out. They never found any further sign of the lady in white or heard anything more about her, but they believed if it had not been for this mystery woman, they might never have gotten their mother back alive.